Hello, and welcome to our second week on the theme of diversity for Awakened. You know, I grew up in a small town in rural southwest Missouri, and the community where I lived was almost entirely white. And when I say almost entirely white, I mean I could count on one, maybe two hands, the total number of people of color in my community. Now that began to change as I grew up. There was an influx of immigration for people who were coming for factory jobs in that small community. But my earliest memories are of a community that was almost entirely white. I didn't understand exactly why that was or even know to question it at that point in my life. But as I went on to college and began to study the history of my town, I realized through newspaper articles about this that the reason my community was almost entirely white was because it had been a sundown town starting about a century before I was born. My community was a railroad town, and originally about half of the population was black because, of course, black folks were building the railroad. That is until a man called Ulysses Hayden was falsely accused of sexual assault and was eventually hanged by a railroad tie outside of my community. My community at that point became a sundown town, and all people of color were pushed out of the community. This, of course, continued to reverberate even as I was growing up, even to today. And yet, I never heard about it in school. I never thought to question the fact that most of the community was white. Now, whenever you grow up in a community like that, it necessarily impacts how you think about the world. And in order to begin overcoming that, you have to recognize it, you have to name it, and you have to be able to do the hard work of seeing your blind spots. A lot of us still have much work to do, and yet that work is so significant, and recognizing that we need to do the work is the first part of the journey. I think about so many people who I knew growing up who have not started the work, folks who still have so much embedded racism that it is difficult to have conversations because they are folks who still actively want oppression of others. It is hard to have a conversation with these type of folks because we don't share the same values that human beings have inherent worth and dignity. However, most of these folks do still identify as Christian. I imagine that me sitting down and having conversations with folks like this is a real spiritual practice. I know it is because I have to have these conversations on a daily basis, actually, with folks who come into the congregation and who are just beginning to do work on uncovering their blind spots. This week, the spiritual practice is to think of someone who you find difficult to be around. That could be someone who has a different ideological position than you. It could be someone who is just a challenge for you, personality-wise, to be around, and to strive to sit down and have a conversation with that person. Knowing going in that it may be emotionally taxing, so try to take care of yourself during the day. Try to give yourself plenty of space to recuperate. And of course, don't have a conversation with someone with whom it would be too emotionally taxing to have a conversation, but think about someone who comes from a different point of view than you. And sit down with them, and as you're having the conversation, try to think about that person as a child of God. Name that to yourself as you are sitting there and talking with them. That is a spiritual practice, to sit down with people who have different viewpoints than you do, people even who you find offensive, and to try to still see them as a child of God. That, folks, is following the teachings of Jesus to the best of our ability. We may not be able to change other people's minds, but sitting down and having a conversation and still being able to come out of that conversation recognizing that even if a person disagrees, even if a person is coming from a place where they are in a very negative space and even actively voting in ways that we find offensive, that if we can come out of the conversation and still try to see the person as a child of God, then that is practicing deep spirituality. This week, I wish you luck in your holy conversations as you try to engage with someone you find difficult. May it be so, and good luck. Amen.